So as we think about habits, we don't know the best way to change them. What assistance can we find in the fight with our habit? It's very important for us to have a good understanding of the habits that might be getting in the way. I've been thinking about processes and system and what happens in the dynamic between processes and results. But that got me going back to a couple of books that I've read, thinking about more to do with habits. Processes are embedded with a number of different systematic habits or behaviors or patterns, if we want to call them that. And so I got to thinking about books like Atomic Habits by James Clear. We also have the book The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And of course, there's Tiny Habits as well. When we think about habits and patterns, they're very much intertwined, but we think about them differently. We tend to think of processes as things like checklists and systems that are either technology-based or have some other mechanism to support our follow-through. But in fact, the system is simply the design, if you will, and the habit itself is what supports the behavior that follows through. So as we think about habits, it's wise for us to reflect on the kind of habits that we have and how we support ourselves in our disciplines and the things that are important to us, which of course brought up this quote by Epictetus, who says, "What assistance can we find in the fight against habit?" Which is a curious thought. And he offers, try the opposite. So in the fight against habit, when I read that, it thought to me, a lot of us recognize some, not all, of our so-called unproductive or bad habits, if we want to call it that. A lot of us are aware of those, like I said, for some and not all. And a lot of times we don't know the best way to change them or to adjust our behaviors because we're not sure either what to do or we're not even aware, or sometimes we don't have what would be called a replacement. James Clear and some other habit experts, if you will, have suggested that when we have a habit, and if we would like to change our habit, it's really, really important that we replace it with something else. If we try to eliminate a habit, and for example, stop smoking, if we choose to stop smoking or we decide to stop smoking, and we don't replace smoking with an alternative habit, then there's a void or a gap in our system, if you will. And what happens in that case is that because we don't have a replacement, we don't really know what to do, so we revert back to our typical habit or behavior or pattern. So the idea of replacing a habit is not necessarily new, but it's certainly something that is important to be aware of. This other side of the fight against habit, when I read it made me really, really curious. Because of course, a lot of us fight with our habits, if you will. We resist our habits. We don't want to change the habits. We're very attached to our habits. And in some cases, our habits are not productive. And we're still quite attached to them. And it's really hard to change them. And yet we have this internal battle with ourselves around our habits. So when we think about the fight with our habit, his question was posed, what assistance can we find in the fight with our habit? What assistance can we find? So therefore, the framing of that says that when we are fighting with our habit, if you will, or when we are resisting, trying to change our habit, which is well entrenched in our system, what happens when we look at the resistance or frame the fight as something that can help us, as a tool in our toolbox to support us in the new behaviors and becoming the future identity or that version of our better self that we are seeking to become. So even in the fight against the habit, we can find help within ourselves. Now, Epictetus offers us the answer, try the opposite. And what that means is if you're doing something that isn't working, then what would be the opposite of that? And the example that comes to mind is there's an episode in Seinfeld, for those of you who may have seen it, where George is trying to turn his life around and Jerry offers George some counsel. And Jerry says to him, if what you're doing isn't working, and if your intuition is not serving you, if it is wrong, if your intuition is wrong, Jerry Seinfeld says to George, why not do the opposite? And the episode goes about showing us how George does the opposite of his intuition and turns his life around. So this is, this idea that there are clues and there's help inside of the resistance. There are clues and help inside our inner battle with ourselves, the fight against ourselves, if you will. So when you're considering things that you are currently resisting, things that you feel are intuitively not working for whatever reason, in your own day-to-day, consider what might be a different approach and just flip it. If you don't know what to do instead, consider changing it and doing the opposite. The other thing that is coming to mind, particularly around our client relationships, remember, we're all leading our clients through transformation as well. We're leading our clients to their better future and their better self. So what that means is when we are leading them, it's very important, if we want to support them in their transformation, it's very important for us to have a good understanding of the habits that may be supporting them and the habits that might be getting in the way and the habits that they are holding on to because they have resistance to change. So when they're having an inner battle and having trouble transforming or changing their behaviors, we have these tools in our toolbox that we might be able to offer our clients and say, would you be willing to try something different? Would you be willing to try the opposite, for example? So this concept of having processes in our system so that we are able to generate a better result and have the path forward in steps, if you will, in the design. We have a path forward in a design that is going to help us create a better result together. The processes and systems are the design. But then we get into the behavior patterns that must actually have the discipline to follow through on those steps that we have designed in the technology or in our processes and whatnot, whether it's technology or checklists or different workflows or whatever you have. But we have human behavior that is going to determine whether those processes are successful. There's certainly a contribution, and a very massive contribution, because all of us are going to do something a little differently. I invite you to notice where you're experiencing resistance, and I invite you to think about where you are fighting with your habits, and what might that fight offer you as a tool for change. What assistance, what wisdom, what learning might you extract from the resistance or from the fight with your habits? Once again, Epictetus offers us the answer: if that's not working, try the opposite. But there might be other wisdom in there as well. It's a good starting point nonetheless. Bye for now.